Crooked emerged from personal experience. I'd been dealing with back pain and sciatica for years. I thought I'd been everywhere and tried everything, and that my only remaining option was surgery. But when I looked more closely, and I've been an investigative journalist for 4 decades, I recognized that scientific evidence was lacking for just about every conventional approach to back pain treatment. The hordes of back pain sufferers, about 77 million at any given time, were essentially at the mercy of a barely regulated industry that's worth about $100 billion annually. Believe it or not, that's more than spent to treat cancer, coronary artery disease, and AIDS combined.
But I'm delighted that you're all here. I'm sorry that most of you are probably suffering from back pain. It's been a mixed blessing. I think this is my 12th event since the book came out a month ago, and I'm always facing down people who are in pain in the audience. I guess that they find great answers in this book, and so I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what you will find in the book should you decide to take one of these babies home with you. Okay? The book is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 is called Problems, for very good reasons. It addresses all of the issues that exist within the back pain industry, where very often patients are offered interventions and they have no idea of the value of those interventions. They don't know if they're going to help or not help. They don't know if they're going to cause harm. And so that's what I deal with in the first half. I look at such things as benefits of chiropractic, of physical therapy, of MRI, epidural steroid injections, spinal fusion surgery, the kinds of surgeries that you find on the internet, usually called minimally invasive or laser surgery. I look at the issues with opioids. In the second half of the book, we deal with solutions. And at that point, I take on everything that I turned up that really has helped a lot of people. Now, you want a quick hint, you want an overview. What I learned very quickly and enduringly for the whole 7 years that I worked on this book is that there is no such thing as a hands-on, you get on the table and I'll do something to you solution to back pain. Not one, anyway, that will last. Now, in the course of the last month, I've read from practically every chapter in the book, but I've been saving one for you, a special one, because you are, as members of the Commonwealth Club, more political crowd, a more socially oriented crowd, and I wanted to talk to you about the opioid wars. I'm sure that you're all very well aware that we have a public health crisis in this country of incredible dimension, one that is not going to be solved in our lifetimes, one that is going to bear fruit for years and years and years. I don't know how many of you saw the article last week about the numbers of babies that are being born addicted to opioids and what kinds of problems they have in the long run. Well, I hate to tell you, but many of their parents were prescribed opioids for back pain. It's not something that gets discussed very much in any of my radio interviews. I haven't had a lot of questions about it. I think people are very shy to discuss the fact that maybe they are now dependent on high-dose opioids. They really don't know how to get away from it. Unfortunately, an awful lot of people have turned to heroin, and we are seeing escalated death rate of white, middle-aged people well beyond anything that has been seen in the last 50 or 60 years. After I finish, we're going to have time for lots of questions because that's what I've discovered. People have enormous numbers of questions, and I try to provide answers. What I like to say right out front is I am an investigative reporter. I spent 40 years at it. I know you'll find that impossible to believe, but yes, it's been 40 years, and I am not a practitioner, and I'm not a therapist, and I don't prescribe anything, and I don't diagnose anything. But what I can do for you is refer you to the literature, often the peer-reviewed medical literature, which I have been through truly, truly with a fine-tooth comb over many, many years. It was often a very difficult challenge because as soon as I thought I had a chapter done and put to bed and I understood everything about that aspect of the industry, what I discovered was I'd wake up in the morning and there would be a story or a new study, and everything had changed over and over again. And nowhere was that more true than in the opioid situation. So let's take a look at this chapter. It's called The Opioid Wars: How Chronic Opioid Therapy Keeps You in Pain. In medicine, change comes very slowly, unless, of course, it happens overnight. When I began my research for this book, opioid therapy was the standard treatment for people who suffered from chronic pain. Over the months and years to come, I would meet dozens of back pain patients whose opioid use had gotten the better of them. These were not street corner addicts, nor were they typically young and impressionable. On the contrary, they were often middle-aged people who reminded me of me. In time, I realized that such stories were not exceptional. For the back pain patient with a chronic condition, being dispatched to pain management was a standard part of care. When I began my research, hardly anyone mentioned risks or side effects. The first time I encountered someone with doubts was when I sat down in 2010 with epidemiologist Michael Von Korff at the Group Health Research Institute in Seattle. He was one of the few scientists who questioned the efficacy of opioid treatments in non-cancer chronic pain patients. In his office, with a view of the Seattle Space Needle and Mount Olympus, I learned that the drugs were not as safe as people seemed to think. For a medical journal, Von Korff had written a highly controversial editorial enumerating the risks of chronic extended-release high-dose opioid therapy, including the potential for addiction and overdose, the possibility that the patient would develop opioid-induced hyperalgesia or increased pain, and the lack of evidence for pain control. On opioids, patients could become lethargic or depressed or suffer from severe constipation, memory problems, weight gain, muscle wasting, fatigue, hormonal imbalances, mood swings, or insomnia. Sound like great drugs, don't they? I'm gonna rush right out and get some. He pointed out that short of suggesting a drug rehab clinic or a 12-step program, neither of which were designed for chronic pain patients, doctors had few options when it came to tapering their patients off high doses of opioids. His little editorial had not gone over well with opioid manufacturers, pain management doctors, or pain foundations. In fact, Von Korff had been denounced for trying to prevent people in pain from seeking relief they deserved. When I left Michael Von Korff's office, I was thoroughly disturbed. I had no idea that I'd spend the next 4 years tracking a story that had more twists, turns, and corrupt characters than a John le Carré spy novel. The history of opium, a nectar milked from the pod of the poppy, is almost as old as the history of the human race. But it was not until 1803 when a pharmacist's assistant discovered a crystallizable isolate of opium he called morphine that it became the palliative used to treat almost every human woe. By the end of the 19th century, the anodyne's drawbacks were already obvious. Although a pharmacist's reference guide of the period observed that regular use led to tremors, paralysis, stupidity, and general emaciation, in 1898, the German pharmaceutical firm Friedrich Bayer and Company offered a new product, a cough suppressant called heroin. 3 times more powerful than morphine, the syrup induced such an alluring sense of well-being that it begot hundreds of thousands of opioid-dependent people on both sides of the Atlantic. 16 years later, the cough suppressant had wrought such devastation in American cities that the U.S. Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, requiring physicians to register with the government if they wished to prescribe it. Physicians who ordered the drug for patients who they recognized to be addicted could wind up in jail. Most doctors stopped prescribing painkillers, except for patients who were hospitalized. For those who suffered from arthritic conditions, at that time referred to as rheumatism, they recommended good, strong whiskey or sticky inflammatory capsicum plasters. These approaches dominated until the 1950s, when Arthur M. Sackler, a brilliant strategist and psychiatrist by training, invented the field of medical marketing, cunningly devising lists of brand new ailments like anxiety and psychic tension. Under Sackler's tutelage, Americans learned that pain or distress, whether emotional or physiological, could and should be resolved pharmaceutically with drugs like Librium and Valium. Sackler's drug company clients sponsored and funded patient advocacy organizations, which dutifully advanced the corporate agendas. Sackler also invented industry-sponsored continuing medical education for physicians, and then to identify high-volume prescribers who could convince their colleagues to get on board, he developed methods of quantifying prescribing habits. He planted favorable articles in the mainstream press, published ostensibly scientific journals that made unfounded claims for clients' products, and developed the hybrid sales tools we know as the infomercial. In 1952, having lost interest in advising others on how to make money, he and his younger brothers bought Purdue Frederick, a small, privately held New York City pharmaceutical firm that produced Gray's Glycerin Tonic Compound, a sherry-based elixir. In 1987, after years of adding nothing more lucrative than laxatives and earwax remover to the inventory, Purdue Frederick received FDA approval for its first blockbuster. MS Contin was a morphine-based drug in tablet form. It allowed terminal cancer patients and others in great pain to escape the intravenous morphine drip. Arthur Sackler died the year that MS Contin entered the market. His two brothers, aware that copycat products were about to emerge from the pipeline, were working on another new drug with an extended release formulation, one that offered 12 hours of pain relief. The plan was to expand the FDA's labeling to allow doctors to prescribe it liberally to non-cancer chronic pain patients. But that would not be easy. It was hard to imagine that physicians would risk prescribing highly addictive drugs to patients with low back pain and arthritis when they knew they could go to prison for it under the Harrison Act. Over the next decade, employing the strategies they'd learned from their late brother, the remaining Sackler siblings set out to alter the way that the medical community had viewed opioids for more than half a century. They were remarkably successful. OxyContin arrived on the market in 1996. 6 years later, the drug produced annual sales of $1.5 billion. Over the 2 decades that followed, OxyContin would rack up revenues of $35 billion, making the Sacklers the 16th richest family in America. Arthur Sackler had already demonstrated that the best way to capture physicians' hearts and minds was to have one of their own do the wooing. To that end, Purdue harnessed the supremely charismatic and handsome Russell Portnoy, a young anesthesiologist who had completed his medical residency in pain management. Under the supervision of superstar neurologist Kathleen M. Foley at Memorial Sloan Kettering, he was investigating better ways to assuage cancer patients' misery. In 1986, Portnoy and Foley published a paper in Pain, the Journal of the American Pain Society, establishing that 38 patients who had been treated with low doses of morphine over a short period had not become addicted to the drug. The authors concluded that under the correct circumstances, opioids could be safely and effectively prescribed with relatively little risk of producing the maladaptive behaviors that define opioid use. Kind of odd considering the history of that drug, right? In support of these findings, Portnoy and Foley cited a 5-sentence, 100-word letter to the editor published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which noted that just 1% of hospital patients who were treated had become addicted. But for the 3 decades that followed, that off-the-cuff letter to the editor from the authors Jane Portnoy and Herschel Jick would serve as the pharmaceutical industry's basis for promoting prescription opioid use. By 2015, Porter and Jick's unfact-checked letter, often described incorrectly as a study, would have been cited 635 times. In the first 5 years that OxyContin was on the market, Purdue Frederick conducted over 40 national pain management and speaker training conferences. Physicians who were willing to spread the word could expect to make up to $3,000 for telling their colleagues, often at lavish dinner meetings or continuing education medical seminars, why Oxy worked so well for them. The strategy could not have been more successful. In record time, ordinary musculoskeletal pain was recast as an enemy to be battled and subdued. Physicians who allowed patients to suffer needlessly were labeled as lacking in compassion. For general practitioners who found themselves with agonized recipients of the Steffi plates, those are very early spinal instrumentation that were implanted in about 6,000 patients, and later on 2020 there was a tremendous explosion when those patients were brought onto the show, and so many of them were damaged that it caused a tremendous brouhaha. For general practitioners who found themselves with agonized recipients of the Steffi plates and other devices entrusted to their care, OxyContin appeared to be a gift. Instead of telling such patients they'd need to learn to live with their pain, they could write RXs for opioids. To help Purdue deliver its message, British-born physician Alan Spanos, who practiced in North Carolina but spoke with a pearly English accent that lent gravitas to his comments, was invited to address its largest physician groups. Purdue made a videotaped version of Spanos' presentation titled, "I Got My Life Back, Patients in Pain Tell Their Story," for distribution among 15,000 doctors across the country. The video included interviews with 6 patients, including the robust, middle-aged Johnny Sullivan, who made his pitch from a construction site. Standing beside heavy machinery, which presumably he operated, Sullivan told viewers that he was thrilled to have found a drug that did not turn him into a zombie. Before OxyContin, even a good day was hell, he said, but now his future looked just great. 5 other patients of Spanos who were interviewed described similar levels of satisfaction. In his narration, Spanos described his patients as well-maintained on long-acting painkillers. With conviction, he cited Porter and Jick, the 100-word letter, and of course Portnoy and Foley, contending that the rate of addiction among pain patients who are treated by doctors is much less than 1%. 2 years after I Got My Life Back was released, Purdue, rosy with success, distributed another promotional video. From one pain patient to another, advice from patients who have found relief. Copies of this video were distributed to physicians' waiting rooms. Patients could watch them there or check them out to view at home. At the end of the tape, the OxyContin label scrolled across the screen. Purdue also produced a sequel to I Got My Life Back, in which Spanos assured viewers that in the 2 years that had elapsed, not one of his patients had become addicted, nor had it been necessary to increase their opioid dose. But the footage told a different story. On screen, Johnny Sullivan, whose future looked so promising 24 months earlier, murmured semi-incoherently that he'd done well with it, and it was wonderful, and there was never a drowsy moment. Purdue's marketing team may have believed that Spanos' informal documentary-style videotapes were not advertising and therefore could fly under the federal regulatory radar that requires pharmaceutical manufacturers to submit all promotional materials to the FDA upon their first use. But when Purdue distributed the videos without the FDA's okay, the company violated the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, a misstep that would have costly repercussions. All right, so now I think we will go to some more questions. I don't want to read to you for a couple of hours. That would be silly. Okay, so
Cathryn,
who's headed for the mic?
Cathryn, I would be curious in your investigative report, your studies, approximately what percentage of the population in this country suffers from lower back pain?
It's about 80% of
Okay.
the population at some point in their lives undergoes an episode, but somewhere in the vicinity of 70,000 people a year go through a back pain episode, and quite a lot of those people head off to see their physicians, a really significant percentage.
Which leads me to my next question, being one of those 80%,
Yes.
who's tremendous amount of suffering. What has been since your book came out, what's the reaction on the part of the medical community to your report?
You know, I was extraordinarily concerned about that, to be honest, before the book came out. And I have been flat out amazed because I have received letters from surgeons, I've received letters from primary care doctors, rheumatologists, many, many, many different types of physicians, different specialties, telling me, thank you so very much for opening their eyes to what's going on, that they really did not have a good picture. What I really try to do in the book is knit together how all these pieces work and how one thing inevitably leads to another. I talk about how many people here have had MRIs? Okay, that's almost the entire audience. Okay, so what is often not mentioned is that an MRI is in no, when I say an MRI, I should have been more specific. I mean a spinal MRI, but that's probably about the same number of hands, I imagine. What's often not mentioned is that an MRI is in no way diagnostic. We have known since the 1980s, when Richard Dio did his first study of it, that people on X-ray, people who have back pain and have all kinds of what are considered anomalies, people with no back pain have the identical anomalies. So that's spines for you. Because you see a herniated disc or a black disc or a flat disc or some stenosis or some bone spurs, well, here's the news on that. So do people who have no back pain whatsoever. And so from MRI, where do we often go? Well, oftentimes you hear, well, you have to have an MRI because you want to have an epidural steroid injection, right? We can't do that without knowing where we need to put it. So we move on to epidural steroid injections. Unfortunately, no one mentions that there is actually no evidence for the benefit of epidural steroid injections for ordinary low back pain, which is often described as axial or mechanical low back pain, and not for spinal stenosis either. There is a small amount of benefit seen on occasion when a patient has a disc herniation that slams into a nerve and inflames that nerve and causes that thing that is like being shot in the leg, known as sciatica. But a lot of us have sciatica, and it doesn't always come from that. So many people wind up having epidural steroid injections for sciatica and will not be effective at all. And I only realized this when I started going through all the medical literature, and that's pretty much all laid out there. But there's a great financial incentive to do these procedures. So back to that question about the only kind of doctor I have never heard from is an interventional pain physician who actually gives epidural steroid injections for a living almost exclusively. This morning, however, on the radio show, I got a call from a neuroradiologist who read those MRIs for many, many years and said, you're right. There's really there's no indication on an MRI as to what the pain generator is in most cases. Question? Another question, please?
Yes. What's your thoughts on the effectiveness of physical therapy for back pain?
Well, there's an entire chapter in this book on that topic, and it's actually that and chiropractic. It's called A Tale of Two Tables. And I really like that title a lot. Just came to me in a dream. I spent a good deal of time looking into this question. Now, we all know that there's such a thing as a traditional chiropractor who puts you on a table and talks about subluxations and makes adjustments. And there are plenty of people who walk off, who leave a chiropractor's office, and yes, they do feel better. They don't necessarily feel better for very long, unfortunately. Sometimes they stop feeling better about the time they get out of the car at home. And there really is no evidence for the benefit of chiropractic adjustments past 1 or 2 in the acute phase of a back pain episode. A lot of people understand the word acute to mean severe. Oh, I have acute back pain. That term acute actually means of recent onset. So when I say an acute situation, I mean a situation of recent onset. Some studies have shown that there is benefit for 1 or 2 adjustments. Now, all of us who've been to chiropractors, and I am one of them, and I went for many, many years, we understand that chiropractors do not make their money by seeing you once or twice. Now, do they? They make their money by seeing you a lot and signing you up maybe for a year or maybe for life. So that's not necessarily going to help you, and as you will read in Crooked, it can seriously hurt you because there is an awful lot of pulling and pushing and stretching of ligaments. And unfortunately, when ligaments are overstretched, they don't come back so fast. So you can also find yourself with a case of pretty severe instability, spinal instability. There's more in this book about what happens when you have your neck cracked. I suggest that no one do that ever again, in fact. The question, I believe, was about physical therapy. Oh, I need to backtrack quickly. There is an entire field of chiropractic, however, that is very helpful. Many chiropractors, having realized that they've hit a wall here, that there is no evidence for what they do, have decided to re-educate themselves as spine rehabilitation experts. And they focus on exercise, and they no longer do adjustments. I interviewed a gentleman down in LA named Craig Liebenson, and he is a DC, a doctor of chiropractic. He hasn't practiced chiropractic in many, many years, but he trains chiropractors who know they have no future to become rehab physicians. They call themselves doctors, so I say physicians, to become rehab specialists. And there's a very good chance that that group of chiropractors is going to be the future of back pain treatment. We just are going to have to wait and see. But if someone wants to adjust you, especially if under any circumstances, but if they bring out that little thing that goes boing, how many of you have gotten to see that little, yeah, that's really fun. Just leave. That's not doing a thing for you. And as I say, there is the potential for some harm. In terms of physical therapy, well, physical therapy comes in a couple of different breeds. You probably have been given a prescription for physical therapy by your physician who may have said to you, and guess what? Your insurance is going to pay for it. Well, that sounds really great, and I thought it sounded great when I was going through this, and I was thrilled to go until I realized that I was going to be examined by the physical therapist for about 30 seconds and turned over to an assistant who was going to give me a page of stick figure exercises, and then she was going to get on her cell phone. I looked around me, and it dawned on me that physical therapy was pretty good for stroke victims and maybe for somebody who had a new knee or a hip. That was working. It wasn't working for back pain patients. As I looked into it further, I realized that there was a tremendous schism between what is known as cookie cutter physical therapy, what physical therapists themselves refer to as shake and bake. First you do a little exercise, then they put a warm thing on you, then they put a cold thing on you, then they jam some electrodes on you, and then you leave. And after about 4 sessions or 6 sessions, you can say that you, quote unquote, failed physical therapy. How many here have failed physical therapy? Oh, well, quite a few. Okay, let's be honest now. How many here have failed physical therapy? I gotta maybe get a few more hands. People fail it 2, 3 times, and guess what? Their surgeons are not unhappy with them because that is an indication that helps insurance companies approve a surgery. And so there are physical therapy clinics, insurance paid, that are in fact partially owned by spine surgeons. It is a kind of an arm's length transaction, but definitely exists. And the goal, effectively, and I've been told this by physical therapists, and you read all about it in Crooked, is to, quote unquote, fluff the patient, don't hurt the patient, make sure the patient does not get better, and that that patient ultimately is a surgical candidate. So that's why very often we don't get better in cookie cutter, insurance paid physical therapy. Now there's an completely different sector of physical therapists who have doctorates, so they are doctoral physical therapists, and they work generally alone or in a very small group. There are no assistants, and they are focused on exercise. That's one that I eventually found, and he was tough as nails. He said to me, I'm going to show you these exercises. I'm going to put you through these exercises. You're to do these exercises twice a day. If you come back here in a week and you don't know how to do these exercises, it means you didn't do them, and I will know, and I will release you from my care. So you can bet I went straight home and I did those exercises without fail, and I got a lot better. And on my website, which you can find at cjramin.com, you don't have to write it down, be very easy to find, I have a very robust resource section. And it has all the information you need to find a physical therapist who has a specialty in orthopedics, who's a doctoral level PT with an OCS behind his or her name, which means that that person has focused on spine and has a real interest in it and understands a lot about how things work and what type of exercise you need to strengthen weak muscles that are not just the muscles we hear about, oh, you know, like strengthen your core. Well, I don't want to ask you where your core is because no one knows, you know. Basically, we think, oh, the core, it's probably somewhere right here. And if we get like a 6-pack here, then we have a strong core. That's not true. That's just vanity muscles. And those are not the muscles that support your spine. The muscles that support your spine are, of course, the columns of muscles that run alongside it. But you also have broad, thick muscles across the back, and those have to be strong, and your glutes have to be strong, and your thighs have to be strong, and you have to know how to use your shoulders right, because you can't just walk around through life like this, now can you, and expect to have a strong back. I see people come to me all the time and they say, I want to tell you about and I just spin them around, and very often they have no butts. No butts at all. They are flat back there. Well, those same people often like to say to me, you know, I understand where back pain comes from. It's because we were never meant to stand on 2 feet. Who's heard that? Anybody heard that? Anybody said that? There's this little thing called evolution, folks. It took millions and millions of years, and we are not built the same way as a chimpanzee. Who's noticed this? A chimpanzee walks like this. Do we walk like this? Not unless things are really, really bad. We don't walk like that, right? So we have developed over many, many years a much longer waist and a much longer spine, but we also have developed the glutes and the muscles in the pelvis that allow for this type of perambulation. So we're very, very different in our anatomy than any chimpanzee. So I don't want to hear that any of you ever said that again, please. No, you were, it has nothing to do with being on 2 feet and unsuited for that job. Who can ask another question?
One thing I noticed when I was working for Medicare, which pays for the elderly and disabled
And
insurance.
all those epidural steroid injections,
Yeah, and a lot of those.
by
so
and large, yes.
One thing
Yes.
that was interesting is one thing we did was measure clinicians on a bunch of quality metrics. And if you look at things like diabetes, they're actually measuring outcomes like A1C levels. And for back pain, what we measured and paid clinicians on, and indeed what administrators would talk about, was reducing unnecessary imaging, reducing opioid prescriptions, both of which are laudable, but to me it always bothered me because it felt like, and I felt like the book was more balanced in this, but when I read about things, when I hear administrators talk in healthcare, it's almost always about, what can we not do? Let's not do things that are unnecessary. Let's not do things that are harmful. It's very rarely about how can we actually treat patients better. And so I'm curious if you agree with that, and if so, why you think that is relative to other conditions where there's actually more of a focus on what works as opposed to just.
So what we need to see, and it's interesting that you are, in the field more or less, is that we need to be able to prescribe exercise. I was giving a talk back east, and a primary care physician stood up and she said, "There's nothing around here. What am I supposed to do? There's nowhere to send them. I don't have any options." Well, there are really good rehab programs in this country, and I describe them in the book and also show you how to find them in the book. But they're not everywhere, and physicians are extremely unfamiliar with options that are not medical options. I was down at Stanford, and I was talking to a surgeon, a spine surgeon, and I said to her, I will just say he because there are virtually no female spine surgeons, and this would be a dead giveaway. But I said to him, I said, how do you feel about rehab programs? And she said, well, some of my drug-addicted patients could do that. And I thought, you actually don't even know what an intensive exercise program, a rehab program that combines exercise and cognitive behavioral therapy, you don't even know what I'm talking about. That's how far away we are from getting the kind of interventions that actually do work. And I'm sure all of you are thinking, well, what works, what works, what works? Well, exercise programs work. They don't work for everyone because certain people are too deconditioned or too disabled to really enter an exercise program. I'm sure in this room we have some of them. You probably have parents who fall into that category. So what works for them? Well, there's a great, great opportunity with Feldenkrais. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of it. I did another Bay Area lecture and everyone knew, but that was Berkeley, so what can you say? But anyway, Feldenkrais is a way of establishing new movement patterns, reprogramming the brain so that different muscles are put into play. And it works for just about everyone, and you don't have to be in good physical shape to do it. Kaiser runs a program. We have an excellent Feldenkrais Center here in San Francisco. They're all over the country, and there are more and more Feldenkrais instructors being produced all the time because it is very valuable. Alexander technique can be very helpful. So can Tai Chi. Pilates in the hands of somebody who knows what the heck is going on can be very useful. People get hurt in Pilates all the time, however. Yoga, particularly Iyengar yoga, is an extremely good option. But what I want to say is you have to carefully select the person who is going to guide you through this because there are far too many cowboys out there. Personal trainer, I could be a personal trainer tomorrow. There is no certification for that. Anyone can call themselves a personal trainer, then there are personal trainers who have been massively educated, and in the book I describe how do you go about finding one who really focuses on people who have back problems. And in the resource section on my website, there are many described as well. I call the people who can really help you, I call them back whisperers, because what they teach you beyond all else is that hurt does not mean harm. Now, that's not always true. There are people who have been in car accidents, people who have had other traumatic injuries, people who have cancer or infections. There are a number of situations in which, yes, hurt does mean harm. It definitely means harm, and it demands the attention of a physician in an emergency room usually. But for most of us, a sore back is a back that is screaming for exercise. And isn't that a sad thing that medicine has not informed us of that? We have another question back there.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher.
Oh, well, how handy to have you here.
There was a study done by the BMJ did a study on the Alexander Technique that had some efficacy in saying that it actually works. But I guess there was a lot of pushing down and repressing of that technique, that study or whatever. And I'm wondering, that seems to be another issue as well, is that when something else comes along and it does work and people can know about it, there seems to be a movement a lot of times to say, well, it doesn't work, or to dismiss it, or to dismantle it, or to say, oh, this is like our brains are constantly being told, oh, this
yes.
is.
We're constantly being
so there's like a mind game.
Medicine must be in charge of your spine.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a mind game going on.
There's a mind game. Yes, she's right, which I assume you could all hear that, but Alexander Technique, a pretty robust study occurred in the UK. It was written up in the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, very, very eminent journal, and it said that these patients, there were several control groups and comparators and, very professionally done. That's not usually the case, by the way, with exercise studies because they're never funded, and frequently those people who are running them do not know what they're doing, so their exercise studies are often, not very revealing. But the BMJ study showed that without question, patients who went through, I think it was 10 or 12 sessions of Alexander Technique did better, and patients who went through 24 sessions were much relieved. So the outcomes were so positive. And what happened in the BMJ, how, you may not know, well, you all know about how you add comments after something is published. And in a medical journal, those comments are usually so polite. And they're, the eminent physician so-and-so and so might want to consider having a look at a study that was done by the eminent physician so-and-so. No, it was like, screw you, that can't be right. And physicians were writing in all kinds. In the UK, they do very little spine surgery, so there were very few spine surgeons, but they do a lot of interventional pain management, and they prescribe a lot of opioids as well. And physicians across the board were writing in and saying, this just can't be right. So that same group scraped together the funding, and believe me, it is not cheap to do this, and they did a second study. And the outcome of the second study was even more definitive than the outcome of the first study. So it looks to me like Alexander Technique is absolutely here to stay, and we shall all allow our spines to float upward and our heads to float up. And we will be light as feathers, and we will feel better. Sometimes I walk down the street in New York like that, and I think, hey man, this really does work. And other times I'm like a troglodyte, but if you do learn the technique, and it's not very hard to learn, you can really make a difference for yourself. I see a question back there.
Have you studied back treatment in different countries, Asia, India, Australia, South America? Do they have different ways of treating it, different cultures?
Yes, I was lucky enough to really make this a global story. It wasn't necessarily my intention to do so, but I started wondering, how are things being done differently? I knew that things were fairly similar in the UK and in Australia and in New Zealand, but really what was happening in Asia? I met a surgeon, a spine surgeon, a very eminent spine surgeon, as a matter of fact, in LA, who was parents were born in South Korea and had spent a good amount of time there. And he said, "Have you heard of the Jaseng hospitals?" And I said, "No, what is it?" He said, "Well, there are 10 hospitals, all of them only for back pain, and they do not do any surgery there." And I was like, quickly give me a contact name or something. And so I got in touch with them, and after about a year of discussing this topic, I went to South Korea, and I spent a week with them at this remarkable facility where exercise is definitely the focus, so is acupuncture, and herbal, what they call traditional Korean medicine, herbal medicine. And it's so interesting because in South Korea, when you have an attack of sciatica or sudden onset of back spasm, you call an ambulance. That's what you do. You don't go home and try and deal with it. You call an ambulance, and the ambulance will take you straight to Jaseng Hospital, where they check you in for a week's treatment. And after they do some acupuncture and some massage, and they get you moving a little bit, they call for 2 identically sized physicians who are appropriately sized for you. And then, although you are in terrible pain, one gets under one arm, the other one gets under the other arm, and walk, damn it, you will walk. And these patients who are clearly in pain start to walk, and they go through the exercise program there, and in a week, they go back to work. That's what they do. If you're really interested in that, on my website, I have a video of the time I spent there. You'll see me all dressed in these weird paper outfits as I go through the herbal medicine production facility, and also see those doctors walking the patients. It's very, very interesting. I think you might enjoy it. I did spend time in Zurich, Switzerland as well, and that's discussed in the book. I wanted to see how an exercise program there worked. It involves a machine called MedX, Medical, which is a huge hulking bear of a machine, and you get on it, you sit on it, all of your limbs are strapped down. It is, it looks a little scary, I have to tell you. I was pretty much flat out terrified, to be honest, the first time I got on it. And it's computerized. They set a bunch of weight pulleys and weight systems, and suddenly this machine starts to fold down on you, the back. And your job is to push it back up. And you have no choice but to use your back muscles because everything else has been strapped down and taken out of the picture. The gentleman who runs the program is named Werner Kieser. His wife is Gabrielle. And she's a physician. He is an ex-wrestler. And they have opened, I don't know how many now, maybe 30 of these Kieser training facilities all over Europe. There's one in Singapore. They're in a number of other continents now. I can't keep up with him. But what we don't have is we don't have them here, which is a shame. And if anybody has some money to spend, I really recommend that you get in touch with Werner Kieser and try to bring that program to the United States, because it'll be expensive, but it will be really worth it. Please.
Do you have back pain today?
Not anymore. No, I had it yesterday. I had it yesterday. My son got married on Saturday night rather, and I was with about 50,000 relatives for the past week, and by yesterday I was really, really feeling it. So I wanted to go get in bed just like everybody else, but what I did instead was find myself a nice exercise bench and some light weights and start moving around. And I know a sore back is a back that needs exercise. So I started moving, and I've been up since about 6 o'clock this morning. I did a radio show this morning. Maybe a lot of you heard that. And it's been quite a day, but here I am. And no, I have no pain today. It is episodic, you have to realize. This is the nature of being human. It is episodic. But you need to know how to get rid of it. Yes, go ahead.
I do a lot of exercising.
I can see that.
And a lot of
Let me see your glutes.
And a lot of core exercise.
I bet he has them. Yes, he does. I can see him from here. Very good.
And I do glute exercises. But I still have sporadic irritation in my sacroiliac. Mm-hmm. So I bought your book thinking that there are people locally that I can get a hold of that will treat me or teach me how to treat myself.
Yes.
To get over any irritation that I have. And when I get it, I can quickly exercise my way out of it.
Yes. Well, there definitely are people who can help you. But one of the reasons that people have sacroiliac problems is that they do a lot of forward bends. You find yoga teachers frequently have sacroiliac issues. Forward bends, unless you really are incredibly flexible in your hips, pull on the sacroiliac joint. They're not working the way they're supposed to, and it's a very delicate little joint with extremely little movement and thick ligaments. So if you keep stretching those ligaments in forward bends or exercises that in some way resemble forward bends, you will, in fact, stretch those ligaments, develop instability in those joints, and as long as you keep doing 100,000 sun salutations each year, you will have sacroiliac pain.
I did that.
You did that, okay.
I blame it on yoga.
You blame it on me, okay.
No, I blame because I did a lot of forward stretching.
Okay, well, there's your problem right there.
That's the issue. So I'm hoping that what I'm doing now is strengthening that area.
That's right. So we have a great understanding that we should stretch all the time. Who stretches every day? Who's a big stretcher? Okay, well, all that stretching, you may need to reconsider. In this book, I talk about the work of Stuart McGill. And thanks for that really good question. And look how great you look, by the way. You are tough as nails. I talk about the work of Stuart McGill, and I really encourage you to read the chapter. Well, I encourage you to read all of them, but read that chapter where he talks about what we understand to be helpful for back pain. We think that stretching will somehow help, but you can be exceptionally weak and be incredibly flexible. Has anyone discovered that about? Have you learned that about yourself? That you're really, really amazing in a yoga class because you can twist yourself all the way around like a pretzel. But unfortunately, you don't have the muscle strength to support your structure while you're doing it. So all that stretching, well, you got to balance that stretching with strength training. And this is something that very few people understand, and I think it is the cause of so much back pain. I have had multiple yoga victims talk to me, and I just always say, are you doing a lot of forward bends? Do you do a lot of stretching? Oh, yes. Well, there's your problem right there. So we can stretch less, strength train more, and be feeling really good. And Stuart McGill will tell you that a flexible back is not a strong back. It's not the aim. Flexibility comes in other joints. The back is meant to be strong and steady and stable in all exercises. It should not be a flexible unit. Go ahead.
It seems that there's a lot of discussion with respect to lower back pain, and how do you find in your investigation that there's so much of a focus on lower back pain, and are you seeing more of a focus coming up on upper back pain? I definitely feel like with people and screens, there's going to be a lot more of the upper back issue as well.
Well, there's the lumbar, right, and the thoracic. And the money is in the lumbar. The money is in the lumbar. There's very little thoracic surgery because one false move and you have a paralyzed patient. or a patient who stops breathing, because there are so many arteries that run through there and that it's extremely easy to do terrible damage. So lumbar surgery, you're unlikely to paralyze a patient. Thoracic surgery, you're much more likely to. So I do think that we're going to see more people with thoracic problems because we have assumed this bizarre posture, which is not native to us, and our generation, and I speak loosely here, is really the first one to be head down most of the time like that. What concerns me much more is we believe that somehow 1 hour of exercise 3 days a week is going to solve our problem. It's not. If you sit 8 or 10 hours, and many of us, if you really want to get honest about it, we sit a lot more than that, because sit at work, sit in the car, sit when at the dining room table, sit on the sofa, maybe go sit in bed then and check the email. There's an awful lot of sitting going on. And what I would caution you about more than anything is take a look at your children and your grandchildren, because what we have decided here is that it is safest to leave them to their own devices. But unfortunately, those are digital, and children are not developing the musculature that they need in order to be healthy adults. And I think we're going to see a wave of back pain and probably a lot of other musculoskeletal disorders that we don't know about because we grew up on the monkey bars and climbing trees and playing sports every single day and having PE at school and hanging from, gymnastics equipment. And a lot of that has gone out the window. This weekend I was watching a bunch of kids in a swimming pool, and these were all kids who had nice parents who probably fed them kale, and they did not have the normal set of muscles. They were just kind of bulky looking. And so it's something that we really have to think about, because we are bequeathing a very bad thing to the next generation.
I was wondering about the episodic part of this.
Mm-hmm.
I wake up sometimes saying, oh, gee, I really feel good today.
Good day.
And then there are other days, oh, did I eat something? Is it the weather? I mean, have you found that there are certain variables that might affect these episodes of good and bad days?
Well, there have been a number of studies looking at what weather does, barometric pressure, and those studies come out completely, they don't find anything. They don't find a relationship. However, personal experience will tell us that when it's crappy weather, it's August in San Francisco, no one feels good the whole month. They just don't feel. So, do I think there's a relationship? Yes, I do, but I don't think that there's any evidence base for it at all. It's funny you mention what you eat. Now, this gets kind of disgusting, but frankly, there is a very close relationship between back pain and constipation. So what you eat does, in fact, affect whether or not you have back pain. People don't realize it, and doctors don't ask about it, interestingly enough. But there is a relationship, and of course there is, because the colon, from an anatomical perspective, the colon and the sciatic nerve are right next to each other. So when you have a colon that is not operating properly, and we'll leave it at that, it will swell and it will make contact with the sciatic nerve. And I have no idea how many cases of sciatica are due to constipation, but I'm betting it's a lot. And so it's really important to, if you suffer from back pain, to think about your diet and add, I bought a Vitamix. Oh, actually, my siblings bought it for me for my 60th birthday, which is so nice of them. I use that thing every day, and it is so excellent for your digestion, and it generally is great for your health. And I think that there is a relationship between what you put in your mouth. But let's talk about something else also. Let's talk about the role of emotional upheaval. Let's talk about anxiety and anger, a number of other feelings that can contribute. But I had one woman stand up at an event and say to me, I know I got rid of my back pain. I said, excellent. How'd you do it? She said, I got divorced. I said, okay, good for you. Good for you. How's your ex? No, I didn't mention him. But there definitely is a role. Some people, many people, probably many of us, carry our anguish, whatever it's about, in the low back. Other people get migraines. Other people have stomach problems. Some people are rageaholics. But there has been shown to be a very clear relationship. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with John Sarno's work. I want to point out that John Sarno's book has been, Healing Back Pain, has been #1 in the category since 1990. And I surpassed him for 2 hours last week on Amazon. But it was only for 2 hours, and his is a classic, and we hope mine will be. But if we all buy the book, I could get another 2 hours where I'm past. So, John Sarno's theory was really exclusively, we don't need exercise, that's not the problem. The problem is anger. And there's a new documentary out called All the Rage, which if you get a chance to see it, I'm sure it will, come to video eventually, probably pretty soon. It's extremely interesting, and it talks about what the emotional tenets of back pain really are and what you need to do to work your way out of that. I believe there's a tremendous relationship. Has anybody here had an I'm going to take your question because you've been standing there so patiently. Go ahead.
I have scoliosis, so I am crooked.
You are crooked, but you look quite straight from here.
I exercise very, very faithfully, but I'm finding the older I get, what would be clinically called the dominant side has more and more back pain. So I'm just wondering if on your website you might address some of the specifics of scoliosis or have any referrals.
Well, there is a very interesting program to address scoliosis, and it is on my website. And if you get in touch with me, I will help you find it there because I cannot tell you everything about it right now. But is your scoliosis, is that congenital? Were you born that way? Okay. So there's congenital scoliosis and there's adult onset scoliosis. And many of you, if you go to see orthopedic surgeons, will hear, oh, you have some scoliosis. And it's adult onset. You were not born that way, and you did not have a progressive disease that left you in a major curve by the time you were in your teens. It's developed over many years. And the reason that adult onset scoliosis develops is because there is a muscular imbalance. You have a much tighter right side than left side. You may have one leg that's a little shorter than the other, but it is a muscular problem which tend to want to correct surgically and does not need to be corrected surgically. For someone who was born with scoliosis and probably went through an awful lot of decision making as a teenager as to whether there should be a surgical procedure or whether you should be in a body cast for an extremely long time, that was very common in our generation, to do that to teenagers. It's a tough thing, but exercise, the right kind of exercise, definitely can help relieve the pain because what's happening is your spine is curving and it's putting more and more pressure on the set of nerves on that side. Do we have any more? Oh, somebody else.
Could you comment on the McKenzie Treat Your Own Back Pain book?
Yes, I can. Ramin McKenzie died right about the time I started this work, so I could not interview him. But I did interview many of his specialists, who are all over the world, by the way, and who you also can find in the resource section of my website. McKenzie is incredibly successful at treating back pain of recent onset. The idea being that you will have more discomfort either in flexion or extension. Flexion being this, extension being a small back bend. And once they are able to figure out which it is, they're able to help centralize the pain from the disc that's affected and then slowly that pain goes away. Now, I am not a McKenzie specialist, and if there is one in this room, I am sure I would stand corrected. It seems to help a lot if someone has a very recent episode. It is not necessarily so successful if you have chronic back pain, because chronic back pain tends to be a situation where your muscles have become very deconditioned, and that's going to have to be corrected. And as I said when we started, no one is putting you on a table and fixing it. And I think I'm going to leave it at that unless somebody else, well, you can always find me, and a lot of people have recently. So thank you very much. I'm very delighted to have been here.